So, while the US can't decide if it's a war or not, or if the Strait of Hormuz is open or not, a huge amount has been happening behind the headlines. And today I'm going to highlight recent actions that undermine press freedom, that are corrupt, or are continuing the white nationalist agenda of the White House. So, starting with press freedom. First, Justice Department lawyers asked a judge to let the government directly search Washington Post reporter Hannah Natansen's electronic devices, which really violates freedom of the press and the kind of sacred protection of press sources. And then the magazine Wired reported that a small conservative legal group used direct access to the FCC chairman's office last September to really accelerate a complaint targeting Jimmy Kimmel and his employer ABC, which is just a really worrying example of how the regulator is being used as a political weapon against any media figures critical of Trump. FBI Director Kash Patel this week threatened to sue The Atlantic magazine after it reported that his colleagues have grown alarmed by what it described as episodes of excessive drinking and unexplained absences. And 2 days after that threat, he followed through by filing a lawsuit for defamation. Trump has also had various run-ins with the media. He slammed the Wall Street Journal for claiming that his declaration of victory amid the Iran conflict was premature. And then he later attacked Democrat leaders, the New York Times and CBS News for also criticizing his Iran operations, including his attack on nuclear facilities last summer. And then finally, Trump actually attacked Fox News because it featured one of the candidates for the California governorship, Tom Steyer, who's a Democrat. And basically, Trump said, why has the network spoken with a Democrat instead of talking about Republican candidates? Really kind of projecting the idea that he thinks Fox is literally an extension of his government. Now, thinking a little bit about corruption and what's been going on there. A senior Pentagon official overseeing AI reportedly has made millions of dollars selling AI stock after the Pentagon entered an agreement with the company xAI. Federal law bars officials from taking any actions in their jobs that benefit their own financial interests, which would definitely seem to apply here. This week, the long-standing CEO of Apple said he was going to stand down, and then Trump posted on Truth Social a long post really praising Tim Cook, where he actually said right out blatantly that he'd given Cook big help when Apple had wanted favours. So he's really being very open about the fact that government influence is being used almost as a personal service for well-connected corporate leaders. Corruption is also undermining the rule of law. So reports came out that Trump has promised mass pardons to those within 200 feet of the Oval Office before he leaves office. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice has requested that a federal appeals judge overturn the convictions for members of the far-right group Proud Boys and the far-right group The Oath Keepers, who were both found guilty of seditious conspiracy over the January 6th insurrection. So another case of the administration rewarding perceived allies. Prosecutors from Jeanine Pirro's office also made a surprise visit to the Federal Reserve, all while Trump has been publicly pressuring his long-term target, Jerome Powell. And the Justice Department also removed a career Miami federal prosecutor who'd been leading the investigation into the former CIA director, John Brennan, who's become a prominent critic of Donald Trump. And the reason they removed her apparently is because she resisted pressure to quickly bring charges against Brennan. The Justice Department then replaced that prosecutor with an attorney who once worked for President Trump. And this is all while Todd Blanche said in an interview to NBC that Americans should be happy that Trump is interfering in the Department of Justice. When he was asked directly about a communication that Trump sent to then Attorney General Pam Bondi, where he implored her to indict several of his political enemies, Todd Blanche said it was just an example of the president being upfront with the American people and making his high expectations clear. So the final thing I want to talk about is nationalism. So firstly, more than 2,500 troops are still in Washington, D.C. months after Trump declared a crime emergency, and there's no clear endpoint for their deployment. So originally, the National Guard were deployed for 30 days last August, but that's just been extended and extended. And this kind of open-ended domestic military presence really normalizes this kind of rule by emergency and projects force into civilian politics. ICE is also continuing its aggressive deportation agenda. So here are just some examples. In California, an immigrant worker was shot multiple times by ICE agents and is left in intensive care. His lawyer said that he had been shot before trying to flee from gunfire in his car. ICE is supposedly prioritising violent criminals for deportation, but recent cases show anything but that. A US citizen has been deported to Mexico following a traffic stop, despite telling the arresting officers that he had his proof of citizenship at home. Then, for the second time in less than a week, a Venezuelan doctor was detained in South Texas. She works in a hospital emergency room in the Rio Grande Valley. She was travelling to join her husband for their asylum interview, which is scheduled for next week. And according to her husband, she has a valid work permit and she was travelling with their 5-year-old daughter, who is a US citizen. ICE also deported an 86-year-old French woman who'd moved to the US to marry her long-lost love, and she was waiting for her green card when deported. And they went after the wife of a US Army surgeon who's been serving for 27 years in the military during her appointment at an immigration office in El Paso. And this is despite the fact that she had legal protection in place from 2019 that barred her from being deported back to El Salvador. Her husband said, "I don't really understand why, because she's followed the rules of immigration law by the teeth since day one." More generally, the Department of Justice fired 2 immigration judges who dismissed high-profile deportation cases against international students who had advocated for the Palestinians. And then the Department of Justice also announced that it was going to sue Connecticut, its governor, and the city of New Haven to challenge sanctuary policies that it said interfere with the federal government's enforcement of immigration laws. And finally, under Trump, the US has almost entirely shut down asylum for those fleeing persecution. In 2025, Trump halted all refugee admissions, including for applicants from war zones, but he did allow Afrikaners, a white minority group that he said was persecuted in South Africa, to seek resettlement. So since October 2025, about 4,500 refugees were resettled in the US. And all, apart from 3, were white South Africans. And then finally, following Trump's fight with the Pope, the administration has taken it out on charity helping migrant children. The Office for Refugee Resettlement has decided not to renew an $11 million grant for the Catholic charity shelter run by the diocese in Miami, which cares for migrant children. So that's it for this week. All actions are available on trumpactiontracker.info, which actually hit 3,000 recorded actions last week. See you soon.